This is a presentation of the Ghost Watershed Cumulative Effect Study. It presents both the findings of Phase 1, which is business as usual, and compares and contrasts them against the beneficial management practices as adopted in Phase 2. To set the stage, the study area is the basin of the Ghost River Watershed, west of Calgary. The concerns are about achieving the appropriate balance between social, environmental, and economic objectives. The client is the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society. The sponsors were Alberta Ecotrust Foundation, Bow River Basin Council, and Calgary Foundation. The analytical work was completed by the LC's group in Calgary, Alberta. As a bit of a harbinger, it's interesting to read the words of Peter Erasmus, where he, in the summer of 1859, working as a guide and hunter for the Palliser expedition, was somewhere in southwest Alberta, west of Calgary, probably not very far from the Ghost River Watershed. And James Hector says to him, "You must prepare yourself and your associates to adjust to a new order in this country. The progress of civilization renders this inevitable." And Captain John Palliser pipes in, "Your work with our expedition is nothing but a phase of things to come. All the great territory now sparsely populated by a few wandering tribes will someday be the homes of thousands of prosperous people engaged in agricultural pursuits, stock raising, and other industries that always follow the settlement of vacant lands." So even we today, over 150 years later, talk about cumulative effects. It's clear that James Hector and John Palliser and Peter Erasmus were all discussing it a long time back. Now the municipal context of the study area can be shown in this map, with Calgary to the east, small settlements and towns west. Here we get to see the municipality of Bighorn, and almost the entire Ghost River Watershed is found inside of that municipality. In terms of biophysical setting, the study area is about 53,000 hectares in size. It's located in the upstream shadow of the burgeoning community of Calgary. And the elevation varies from less than 1,300 meters above sea level up to greater than 2,300 meters above sea level. And it's this variation in aspect, slope, and elevation that creates a tremendous diversity of plant communities, as we can see from the satellite image here. And it's the texture of this landscape and how it's managed not only by land uses, but also by natural disturbance regimes that determine how water flows through this landscape and the habitat for biodiversity, both flora and fauna. Moving from top to bottom in elevation, we have the alpine communities, as shown here, the subalpine communities, shown lower elevation and alpine, the montane forest communities that dominate these big, broad river valleys, the foothill fescue communities further down in elevation and to the east. And scattered across all of these plant communities are the wetlands, where slope and aspect are such that water is held back and wetland communities occur. Now these landscapes have been anything but static in the last 10,000 years since glacial ice sheets retreated. They have been shaped time and time again by fire events, by insect outbreaks, by herbivory such as bison and elk, and because of the acute interannual variation in rainfall and snowfall and in temperature that melts it, significant variation in hydrology, collectively shaping the diversity of these plant communities. Now the Ghost River Watershed is upstream of Calgary, and it's part of the Upper Bow Basin. And water, of course, flowing downhill to its major market, that of Calgary, and land uses further south. And here we get to see the location of the Ghost River Watershed relative to the Upper Bow Basin. Now the key overarching questions being asked by this study is, can the Ghost Vaporous landscape sustainably support ecological services, aesthetics, recreation, agriculture, and the various industrial demands, not only for today, but for our kids and for our grandchildren? More specifically, this project wanted to gain answers to the following questions. Will the landscape continue to provide clean water supply for downstream users, such as the people of Calgary? Will there be a healthy natural areas providing high-quality wildlife habitat? Will this landscape satisfy both the motorized and the non-motorized recreationalists, quickly growing in size, that are seeking high-quality non-urban experiences? And will natural resource extraction industries such as forestry remain sustainable? This project was dominated by a series of workshops where stakeholders came and discussed their thoughts, their ideas, their concerns, and several emerged. One was around ecosystem awareness, planning, and management, that it wasn't as developed in terms of our appreciation for these needs as it should be. A second was the need for government to step up and provide greater leadership, not only at the strategic level, but right through to tactical planning. Emerging concern about the effects, the adverse effects of the off-highway vehicle industry in these basins. But to sum it all up, it's a balance of diverse interests. How do we build plans for multiple overlapping land uses that do not jeopardize the ecological goods and services of these important watersheds? Now, the key indicators which reflect the issues are the amount of anthropogenic or human-caused linear edge, access roads to well sites, to cut blocks, to acreages, pipelines, seismic lines would be examples. Water quality, which is essentially a measure of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment emissions. Mortality index for grizzly bears. In other words, are they dying at too fast a rate in order to allow the maintenance of populations? The integrity of native fish communities. The quality of the land for non-motorized recreational potential, and forest harvest. So these are the indicators for the study. Now, before we can move on to the business beneficial management practices, it's important to review phase one, which is business as usual. And this document can be downloaded from the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society's website, which is shown at the bottom right here. Now, the general steps of this project was to customize a version of the LC's landscape simulator for the Ghost Watershed, to take the GIS data of the Ghost Watershed and to stratify it and place it into the model, to reconstruct the history of all land uses in the last 100 years in the Ghost Watershed, to make sure that we are incorporating the proper role of natural disturbances like fire, to understand each of the land use trajectories in terms of forestry and energy, agriculture, whether it be crops or livestock, residential and recreation, and to make sure that these land uses are unfolding in the landscape as desired by the various industrial proponents. That's what makes this business as usual. And then to conduct these simulations and to report out for the indicators in both graphic and tabular formats the performance of these indicators. Now, some of these indicators are ecological, and so we need to spend a bit of time understanding the range of natural variability. That's this green bar here. And the index we're looking at here is water quality through time. And the key message we're trying to convey is even without people or any land use, these ecological indicators go up and down, reflecting interannual variation in fire and insects and flooding and herbivory. So this is a good thing. Variation is a good thing. It's characterized these landscapes for tens of thousands of years. And the range of natural variability here provides us a reference point against which we can compare the performance of indicators. The idea being that as indicators move progressively down below the range of natural variability, they're doing less well, and the amount of risk to these indicators is heightened. Now, looking at the first indicator, that's of linear edge. These are the long, skinny things, the seismic lines, the pipelines, the roads, the trails of off-highway vehicle and hiking. And what we see is in the past 100 years that it's increased and now sits at around 5 kilometers per square kilometer. Now, that's quite concerning because a lot of ecological indicators begin to respond less favorably at 2 kilometers per square kilometer. And the simulation indicates that in the future, so this was the past 100 years, and in the future for the next 50 years, that edge density is simulated to increase. Even though we will continue to have reclamation, the rate at which it's being produced exceeds the rate at which it's reclaiming, and therefore the amount of edge we have will continue to increase. In terms of water quality index, which again is a reflection of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, 1 would reflect essentially very, very high water quality and 0 very poor. Here we get to see the range of natural variability, and in the last 100 years we have seen a significant loss of water quality because of additional emissions of sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and that water quality will continue to decline in the next 5 decades. So not a very encouraging story there. In terms of grizzly bear mortality index, where natural levels of mortality would be indexed at 1, we see how they've increased to essentially doubling to today. So an argument could be made that even at a rate of 200% higher than natural, that sustainable resident grizzly bear populations may be very difficult to maintain in these basins. And even though we may be seeing bears, it's quite likely that these bears are coming from other landscapes that are source populations and into the Ghost. The alarming story is that the index is expected to climb significantly in the next several decades, suggesting that it'll be exceptionally challenging in a business as usual scenario to maintain grizzly bears in the Ghost Watershed. With respect to native fish, communities. So they'd be like East Slope cutthroats and native varieties of rainbow. Here we get to see the range of natural variability, and that we're below the range of natural variability today, and that it's expected to continue to decline in the next several decades. Again, not a very good news story for native fish. Non-motorized recreational potential is basically a reflection of the attractiveness of the landscape for people to hike or fish or ski or angle on these landscapes. And a lot of it has to do with aesthetics, and because of the increasing industrialization of the landscape, whether it be the logging, agriculture, cattle, motorized recreation, we've seen a significant decline in the last 100 years, and that's expected to continue further slide in the decades to come. So this landscape is not as attractive to non-motorized recreation because of the noise of the off-highway vehicles or ability to see them, because of cut blocks, because of access roads to well sites, because of agriculture and other things that most people would not associate with a pristine East Slopes experience. Now, with respect to the last of the indicators, and that of softwood harvest, this graph indicates shortfalls. So what you would want is for the graph to be right at the bottom here. And this graph indicates two things. First of all, without fire and insects on the landscape, the current level of wood harvest by the FMA holder is sustainable if the measure of performance is that of wood production. However, if fires were to occur on the landscape, the current level of wood harvest eventually would have to be adjusted. And that's how the current approach is adopted by the Alberta Forest Service, is to wait until fire events occur to understand their magnitude and to negotiate an understanding with the FMA holder as to the magnitude of shift in the annual allowable cut. So the point here is wood is being harvested on this landscape today. It is part of the FMA, or at least a portion of the watershed is, and the level of wood harvest that is expected off that portion of the landscape is sustainable if fires don't occur and is not sustainable if they do. So this landscape historically has been influenced by natural disturbance regimes, insects, herbivory, fire. But today the landscape is being shaped by multiple overlapping land uses that include croplands, rural residential, random camping, people in the backcountry on horses, the hydrocarbon sector in terms of exploring, extracting, and translocating hydrocarbons, the logging activities that are coming to this particular basin, the access roads required for cut blocks, for well sites, and for acreages, motorized recreation, livestock grazing during summer months, hiking, alpine type activities. So the landscape is busy. In the recreational sector, especially with Calgary being so close immediately to the east, every day and particularly on weekends is placing a lot of people on the east slopes of the Canadian Rockies, and the Ghost River watershed is very close to Calgary and Cochrane and Canmore, and is experiencing increasing levels of demand for recreation. Calgary being 1 million people right now, you can imagine the pressure for recreation as it moves from 1 to 2 million people in the next several decades. So the major conclusions of Phase 1 is that during the past century, key indicators of the Ghost River watershed have declined significantly from range of natural variability. And furthermore, they're expected to decline even more so. The performance and trajectories of these key indicators were shown not to be acceptable to the project stakeholders of this project. They said that's an undesirable or unacceptable destination. So the question that emerged is, can the performance of these indicators relative to business as usual be improved through the adoption of a suite of beneficial management practices? Okay, let's back up a bit here. The people that live in and around the Ghost have said it's special. That's not surprising. Most people say their landscapes are special. I think the key question to ask is, how does the Ghost contrast itself, or how does it fit into the provincial story? And so what we're doing here is we're going to look at the Ghost, and there it is looking big, and here it is looking small in scale to the entire province of Alberta. And we're going to ask ourselves, how does it fit in with a variety of land use trajectories that are unfolding at the provincial scale? And we'll start with the human population. So the graph on the right showing the population grow. Back here in 1930, about 3/4 to maybe 80% of Albertans were living in the country. Now population continues to grow, and we get to see that 80% of the 3.8, 3.9 million people in Alberta today live in cities. And the vast majority of those live in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. And what we see is the Ghost River watershed is not distant to, but in fact very close to basically about 80% of all Albertans. It's in their backyard. So that's something that's very important to understand. It's very close. And if we look at the population here as grids, township by township, we see the same general pattern. Again, where the majority of people in Alberta live, and the Ghost River watershed immediately upstream, and in fact with people living in it on the eastern edge, the white area. Okay, if we just look at rural residences, so these are the acreage and farmers, we can see that the non-rural people were farmers. There wasn't a big acreage phenomenon back then, but it starts in the 60s and explodes in the 70s, and if we move to today, we see that the rural residential people are again living around the major centers in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor and are now also living in the Ghost River watershed. And they also have demands and requirements for infrastructure. Okay, let's look at it from the perspective of Calgary. There's Calgary. The year is 1951. Calgary is 93 square kilometers. If we move forward to 2007, Calgary is about 580 square kilometers, and you can see the surrounding communities of Airdrie, Cochrane, Black Diamond, and Turner Valley, and Okotoks. And if Calgary were to continue to grow in area, and we'll just normalize the shape, so just an example only, by 2057, Calgary would be around 3,000 kilometers and would have extended out to Cochrane. And in this case, we'll let Calgary grow into the Tsuut'ina Nation, which probably in reality wouldn't happen. But the point is that Calgary is already much bigger today than it was back in the 1950s and is continuing to grow out, as are the surrounding bedroom communities. And the point here is if we place the Ghost River watershed in context, we get to appreciate just how darn close it is to Calgary, and the demand for recreation and water and biodiversity will continue to grow, and the Ghost watershed will be part of the solution to that demand. Now, in terms of croplands, here we're seeing the arrival of crops in native prairies, the short and tall grass prairies moving west into the foothills and north into the parkland. The Peace River area takes off as far as its agricultural potential. The point here is that there is a bit of agriculture in the Ghost, but not much. But the Ghost is upstream immediately to agriculture. And of course, the single greatest user of water is agriculture, and specifically irrigation. The Ghost is an important landscape in terms of maintaining water quantity and quality for agriculture too. And associated with the crops is livestock production, and here we get to see the growth of the livestock herd, the provincial livestock herd, and there's a lot of correlation between where cattle are found and where forage crops are grown, and we actually have cattle grazing in the eastern portion of the Ghost, and so that's a land use too. Forest management agreements were formalized in the 1950s, although logging's been occurring in Alberta since basically mid-1980s. And the most recent FMA, that of Spray Lakes, overlaps with portions of the Ghost River watershed. And so there we get to see it. So another land use that's influencing the Ghost River watershed. The hydrocarbon sector here, looking at the footprint of well sites, has certainly grown provincially. And here we're looking at not only conventional oil and natural gas, but coal bed methane and in situ. And even though there's a lot of attention in the Fort McMurray area, you can see that many other parts of Alberta have been heavily influenced by the footprint of the energy sector, as has a portion of the Ghost. The Ghost is relatively unaffected, but has some footprint of the energy sector. Transportation networks started at the turn of the last century. These would have initially been trails, then become ungraveled roads, and then eventually graveled, but we get to see the emergence of a full transportation network throughout the white area of the province Alberta and its distribution. And the Ghost, although very close to high densities of road itself, has a relatively low density of major roads today. Water demand is simulated by keeping track of all the livestock, all the agricultural crops, the people, and various industries that require water to either harvest resources or to process them. And not surprisingly, water demand in the province of Alberta has increased significantly. I think we're up around 6 billion cubic meters of water per year required to make Alberta's economy function. So in red, you're getting to see all the demand. There's a little bit of demand for water inside of the Ghost. Again, the Ghost's key role here is in provision of water quality and quantity, but it's found very close to significant demands for water in the province of Alberta. Here we're looking at natural landscape, and of course it's been declining through time, the scale between 100% and 70% for the entire province. And we get to see those portions of the province that have essentially lost all of their natural landscape, and the ghost, in contrast, is for the most part intact and characterized by natural landscapes, not by anthropogenic, at least not in area. The same could not be said for edge or linear features. There's a lot of linear features in the ghost, but in terms of area, it's still relatively natural. Now, if we look at the ecological goods and services, and what I mean here is water quality, water quantity, and carbon, biotic carbon, we can see that ecological goods and services in the province of Alberta has declined through time. Provincially, we've lost about 20% of ecological goods and services with respect to those three variables. And here you get to see the locations where the loss is highest, shown in red. Now, where it's white or very light yellow is areas that have significant amounts of ecological goods and services. So the point here is a ghost today has high ecological goods and services, and it is found exceptionally close to areas that have very little ecological goods and services, meaning that the people that reside here looking for those experiences of water quality, water quantity, natural landscapes, and biodiversity will be traveling to a large extent west, and the ghost will be one of the landscapes into which they try and meet the demands for those ecological goods and services. So let's try and place the ghost into context of what's going on around it. Here we're looking at Calgary in the southwest corner. Imagine ourselves up in a Cessna. We're kind of looking west by northwest. Maybe we're flying at a couple thousand feet. And here we get to see the boundaries of the ghost watershed. We remind ourselves of the large urban footprint of Calgary, and to the west of Calgary is a network of smaller communities, Canmore, Cochrane, Bragg Creek, Redwood Meadows, Benchlands, Seavey, those types of communities. And we see a very strong agricultural footprint. I'll just drape it over. Places where we have a lot of agriculture. We certainly have a lot of rural residential in there too, a lot of acreage people. And we can also see the footprint of existing cut blocks. So there are not a lot of cut blocks in this landscape today, but the FMA extends into the ghost, and Spray Lakes is required by their Forestry Act to, of course, log the FMA and follow the rules of that legislation. So what this tells us is that in terms of services, the ghost currently provides water, it provides wildlife and carbon, residential, transportation, recreation, wood fiber, forage crops, cattle pasture, and oil and gas. So this landscape that may have, for so many decades, seemed so big with so little going on, it's now becoming very clear to people. This landscape is finite. We have multiple overlapping land uses, all of which are growing, and they're bumping into each other, making it quite apparent that we need to make some tough decisions about what this landscape is intended to be, what services it will provide, and what management practices will deliver those. Okay, so in a provincial context, I think we can say that the Ghost River Basin has contributed significantly in terms of water quality and quantity to Calgary and other downstream communities, that the Ghost is immediately upstream of many of the industrial features: burgeoning cities, towns, rural residential, intensive agriculture, and other intensive industrial features. It is itself unbelievably high in ecological goods and services, and it's right beside portions of Alberta that are much lower in ecological goods and services. It's today contributing to meeting the recreational demands of more than 1 million people, and we need to remind ourselves that in the next 50 years that'll grow to 2 million people, and that it has phenomenal ecological goods and services, and are right out the back door of places where people live, where they don't have those features there. So of course the demand is to get up, to leave work and residences, and to drive or hike into the Ghost and enjoy those services. So it's quickly becoming very busy with overlapping land uses, all of which are growing. So that sets the stage for the beneficial management practices. That's phase 2 of the Ghost Watershed Cumulative Effect Study. And the key challenges here were to contrast against business as usual and see if a suite of beneficial management practices could improve the performance of these indicators. Now this work has been written up and is currently being reviewed, and in short order will be available online at the Ghost Watershed Alliance's website for download. A good portion of this work was facilitated by workshops where people discussed beneficial management practices and issues. So here we see the letter that was sent out by the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society to invitees. Here we see a list of the people that were invited to attend these workshops. Now, so the selection of beneficial management practices as by the ELSI's group came from a variety of different sources. Certainly from feedback of these facilitated beneficial management workshops of the Ghost Watershed, in discussions with the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society members themselves, by reviewing government policy and legislation documents, particularly those pertaining to the Alberta Land Use Framework, the Southern Foothills study that had previously been completed in the East Slopes further south and certainly looked at beneficial management practices. We in detail examined the findings of the Upper Bow Basin Cumulative Effects Study and also discussed beneficial management practices with multiple stakeholder groups that were part of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. So collectively, those pieces of information inform the ELSI's model as to what those beneficial management practices would be. Now, in terms of themes or general areas to which they applied, include cattle grazing, croplands, forestry, rural residential, energy, recreation, motorized recreation, reclamation, and culverts. So the goal here is to understand that, in terms of laying it out as a schematic, that increasing human population is requiring increasing amount of commodity production, wood, livestock, crops, and energy. This in turn is, and the increasing human population is also increasing demand for recreation, and it's increasing the demand for rural residential. So all these three things are happening at the same time. These are in turn changing the landscape. We're seeing increased amounts of linear features and access, a reduction in natural landscapes, elevated nutrient runoff, we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, and younger and more simplified forest structure. All of these things in turn affect the key indicators. So as these landscapes change in structure and function and age class and nutrient movement and water availability, it influences these indicators. So by understanding this scheme, we can ask ourselves what best management practices can be imposed, implemented, deployed in these landscapes to allow us to produce commodities while minimizing the adverse effects of these land uses on the indicators. So to do that requires us to understand the behavior, the mechanisms of what's going on in this landscape. And one of the key stories is that of linear features. The linear features that we showed before have significantly increased into that 4 to 5 kilometers per square kilometer range. And you need linear features for almost all land uses. To get to acreages, to get to cut blocks, to get to well pads, to allow people to hike on. So these land uses have been building more and more of these linear features, and the rate at which we're building them greatly exceeds the rate at which we are reclaiming them. And so when we look at the performance of many indicators very important to Albertans, these ecological indicators, and if you understand them in detail, you would realize that they are driven by the amount of linear features that have so quickly grown on the landscape. So rather than viewing them as problems themselves, we have to see the loss of ecological goods and services as a symptom that reflects a cause. And of course, the cause is these linear features. So society really does need to come to grips with how many of these linear features we want on landscapes and how are we going to build them, and equally important, how are we going to reclaim them. If we look at the non-motorized community itself and ask them what is adversely affecting their enjoyment in the Ghost Waiparous area, what we see very clearly is it's the motorized recreational community, and random camping and large parties are examples of activities that are interfering or reducing the enjoyment of their activities. So just another example of how two land uses are bumping into each other, reminding us that trade-offs are occurring and tough decisions are required. You can't do everything everywhere all the time, and the kind of activities of the motorized recreational community are not always desired by the non-motorized recreational community. So again, heavily influenced by linear features. So here we're looking at linear features in just one of the townships, and in this case putting a 50-meter buffer on each side, showing areas that non-motorized recreationists would experience a loss of enjoyment because of movement of off-highway vehicles through these communities. These landscapes are also going to be logged, and as we log them, we're going to change their structure, we're going to change their appearance, and in some cases change their function. And some of these landscapes will have less or lower aesthetic appeal for the recreational community than the mature forest. So that's one of the logical consequences of having logging. Not only does it change aesthetics, though, it can change water quality, and it can change wildlife habitat. One of the key challenges, particularly in these landscapes that have lots of slope and elevation, as we log them, is that we can significantly increase the amount of rate of nutrient movement, particularly sediment, as shown in the upper left-hand corner. We can also log through ephemeral draws, and that can significantly influence movement of water. So we need to do a good job of understanding where those first-order streams are and protecting them. So the landscape is scheduled to be harvested, and that portion that's inside of the FMA, and how we log it, what kind of structure we leave behind, how we build our crossings will significantly influence the aesthetics at a cut block scale, as we see here, right through to a landscape scale we see here. So forestry, very important land use practice on this landscape. It's very important that we have a good discussion about how we're going to conduct it. Water is certainly influenced by, water quality is influenced by nutrient movement. So we have cattle on the landscape, and not uncommonly in water, along water, and urinating and defecating in these systems, which introduce all sorts of organics and pathogens. We have non-random camping, leaving garbage throughout the landscape. Again, we talked about the linear features and their ability to deliver sediment to water, and the off-highway vehicle community often actually transforming the landscape for the kind of experiences that they might want in terms of creating bogs. These linear features, particularly roads, move sediment along the ditches, which comes down into water. And of course, we have roads and they encounter streams. We build culverts, and these culverts often hang, particularly when we get flood events and they scour out in the lower sections of the culvert, and that can interfere with the movement of fish. The energy sector also creating linear features to get to these well pads. So the linear features themselves are seismic lines, the road to the well pad, and the pipeline that leads away from those. And that can certainly influence linear features plus sediment movement. So when we look at it all in all, the water quality of these landscapes reflects what's going on upstream and is a reflection of all the multiple overlapping land uses in terms of how well they deliver and or hold back sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And this is a key issue to this watershed. And as we've seen, water quality has significantly declined in the last 100 years. We also have the ability to examine how beneficial management practices relative to business as usual will influence, in this case, one of the measures of water quality, and that's sediment movement. And some of these features, transportation, are generating lots of sediment movement, so are off-highway vehicle trails compared to some of the other land uses as energy. So forestry is certainly large, transportation very large, off-highway vehicles very large, and here we get to begin to see to what extent we can begin to reduce the movement of sediment as we begin to adopt beneficial management practices. We'll talk more in detail about that. So what were these beneficial management practices of Phase 2? Which were the ones that we actually deployed? We'll start with cattle. And I'm going to go over these in fairly general terms, and there's a lot more detail. And certainly anyone seeing this presentation is welcome to contact the LCS group for more detail. But in terms of cattle grazing, the beneficial management practices could be defined as following. The increasing the amount of riparian fencing that keeps cattle off of streams and ponds. The amount of off-stream salting that occurs. Increasing the amount of hard stream crossings where we do have to cross streams, trying to put crossings in that would minimize the amount of sediment coming in. No more overwinter feeding along streams. A focus on winter grazing of fescue where fescues exist. Rotational grazing where it applies. And a greater dependency on perennial grasses for forage rather than annual grasses. So those are the beneficial management practices for cattle grazing. With respect to croplands, BMPs include proper timing and application rate of fertilizers, improved riparian protection, so we're actually backing away from a lot of these lands that are currently cultivated right along creeks but could be transformed back into riparian forests or shrublands. No more complete no-till crops and no more till crops. No expansion of croplands into native prairie, wetlands, or improved pasture. And again, an emphasis on perennial crops rather than annual crops where we do have croplands. In terms of forestry, the beneficial management practices involve maintaining buffers, the absence of logging on ephemeral streams, avoiding steep slopes, and an increase in the amount of structural retention or green trees on cut blocks. In terms of the in-block forestry roads, reducing the regeneration lag between the construction of these in-block roads and their functional reclamation. Managing access on forestry roads, so those roads would be available for obviously forestry land use, but not necessarily available for other types of land uses. Installing bridges rather than culverts. And in this one, we looked at a reduction of annual allowable cut of approximately 25% required to achieve the increase in cut block structure of residual green trees and the expansion of riparian buffer strips. So those are the BMPs for forestry. In terms of rural residential, improve septic technologies, because many of these soils are very shallow, they're cold, their ability to, in a biological sense, decompose human waste is very limited, and there's better technologies out there to ensure that human waste doesn't get into aquifers. Certainly improved riparian management, not allowing acreage homes to be very close to water, to shift towards cluster development rather than what I call expansive or extensive development, to try and minimize the total need for infrastructure and the effect of rural residential on natural landscapes, and then just do not allow future expansions of rural residential into landscapes that are currently defined as natural. In terms of the energy sector, relative to business as usual, an immediate reclamation of well pads and access roads following the abandonment or the non-production phase of these wells, installing bridges rather than culverts, increasing the number of hydrocarbon wells per pad, so that's pushing us into a greater level of dependency on horizontal drilling for those formations that it makes sense to do that. Pulse reclamation of seismic lines and minor roads. So by pulse reclamation, we mean getting out there today and deactivating a significant percent, in this case 90% of the existing seismic lines or minor roads that are not needed for resource development. And that can be done by physical obstruction, by cutting trees across seismic lines. Those would be examples. And the last would be, in the future, certainly low impact avoidance seismic lines. Those are ones that are less than 2 meters, and therefore when you construct them, not likely to allow or encourage the off-highway vehicle community to use them. In terms of general recreation, improving sanitation. Just putting toilets and sanitation facilities at trailheads and roadheads. Secondly, providing waste receptacles for garbage. In terms of motorized recreation, removing that activity from surface water. So just saying no off-highway vehicles in the waterways themselves, the streams, the ponds, and the wetlands. Most importantly, a proactive construction of a properly engineered off-highway trail network is part of the best beneficial management practices. So off-highway vehicles, we're suggesting, do have a role to play and are an important land use in the Ghost River watershed, but that their activities need to be restricted to a trail network that actually is a little bit bigger than the one that is currently recognized in this basin today. All stream crossings of this network would be bridged, and that the off-highway vehicle community would be restricted to this designated trail and would no longer be using those trails that are not part of the designated trail system. Of course, this would also require effective and consistent enforcement. In terms of beneficial management practices for roads and culverts, the beneficial management practices is finding those culverts that are hung and replacing them as quickly as possible, and wherever possible, moving away from culverts to bridges. So let's ask ourselves, how did these beneficial management practices perform relative to business as usual? And these, again, are the indicators we're looking at. So we'll start with linear edge density. There's that historical pattern. Here is our business as usual. And by just adopting access management, and access management, just to refresh our memory, is basically saying that we have a transportation network and not everyone can use it. There will be additional gates and people will have to park in designated locations. They'll still have full access to the landscape, but not in a motorized way. So by doing that and removing these seismic lines and some of these access roads, we can significantly remove linear feature density right away. However, it will continue to grow in the future because the rate at which new features are being built will exceed the rate at which we've reclaimed. But clearly, a significant reduction in linear features is possible. And rather than doing it as a pulse, we could also do it as an incremental step-down function of applying every basically 10 years, 20% of the BMPs as compared to doing it all right away. So yes, beneficial management practices can significantly reduce the amount of linear edge by about half. In terms of water quality, again, historical, where we are today, where we're going, and we can see a significant improvement of water quality by adopting access management and pulse reclamation, by adopting the beneficial management practices of the forestry sector and that of agriculture. So here we're seeing each beneficial management practice piled on top of the previous one, and we can make about half of the loss of water quality go away, or in other words, we can improve the water quality by about double by adopting these beneficial management practices. Do we go back into the range of natural variability? No, but we significantly manage risk. In terms of grizzly bear mortality, yes, the beneficial management practices, particularly if we have access management and forestry, can significantly reduce grizzly bear mortality relative to business as usual. But we need to remind ourselves that it still goes up even relative to where we are today. And today's level of mortality index for grizzly bears is probably too high to maintain resident viable populations. So this suite of best management practices is mitigating risk, but at the same time, it's unlikely that we could even maintain grizzly bears as resident populations in this landscape. So not a very good news story there. In terms of native fish integrity, there's range of natural variability, our past, where we are, where we're going to go with business as usual. And again, by adopting access management, we make it better. By adopting the best management practices of forestry, we make it better. But where we really see a big bump is doing both of those, plus replacing these hung culverts. We reduce the amount of what we call lodic discontinuity or fragmentation of these watersheds, and we can make these fish populations and communities much better than they are today by adoption of best management practices. Still not back in range of natural variability, but much closer. The adoption of best management practices significantly and would immediately improve the overall aesthetic and desirability of the Ghost Watershed for non-motorized recreation by, again, access management and pulse reclamation. So basically, hikers would not be bumping into as many off-highway vehicles and or hearing them. Many of these linear features would be removed, but then that would focus the hiking community onto those that are remaining. And one could do that as a pulse today or adopt it as a series of steps through time. The point is that non-motorized recreation potential today is quite low relative to where it was, but could be significantly improved. Softwood harvest, if we want to keep this line at the bottom, meaning there's no shortfall and there's a sustainable amount of wood supply, we would have to reduce the cut by about 80% at least. And we show here we have to drop it by 25% to get to 75% of current harvest levels to ensure a continuous flow of wood in a future landscape where it is being logged and these other beneficial management practices are being adopted. So it certainly doesn't mean that the forest sector cannot play a role. In fact, it can play a very important role in terms of maintaining a lot of these other ecological goods and services, but the harvest level would have to come down, and by approximately 1/4. So let's review. The issue was high level of landscape fragmentation. The BMPs were accelerated rates of reclamation of linear features such as seismic lines, minor roads, in-block forestry roads, and non-designated off-highway vehicle trails. And yes, big check mark, that makes that problem much less than it would otherwise have been. Another issue was high levels of vehicle accessibility. There's lots of trails that allow trucks and motorcycles and quads to move around the landscape. So restriction of off-highway vehicle activity to a properly engineered and designated off-highway trail system minimizes the adverse effects on erosion and wildlife and provides safe and enjoyable activity by that community. Another BMP, of course, is that enforcement needs to be increased to minimize off-highway vehicles' use of non-designated trails and to contain them on the designated trail network. There's no sense building this network of trails that is designated if people are not enforced to be there. Another issue was high levels of watershed discontinuity, and the BMP there was to replace the washed out hung culverts with new culverts and or bridges, and of course that also succeeded. Another issue was loss of riparian habitat, forest structure, and wood security, and this is where the forest sector can certainly play an important role. A reduction, a fairly modest reduction, about 25%, was shown in the model to not only minimize the likelihood of a fall down because of future fire events, It increases the amount of structure on cut blocks. It increases the visual attractiveness of these communities. It increases the ability of these cut blocks to capture and hold nitrogen and phosphorus, and most importantly, sediment back so that it doesn't come into watercourses. So that's a very important BMP there. Reduce water quality from elevated nutrient runoff. Well, there's many BMPs that contribute there. First, increasing the protective buffer strips along streams found not only in cut blocks, but also currently along croplands. Restricting livestock away from streams. And you're doing that through off-stream watering, salting, and through construction of fences. Also, the accelerated reclamation of unvegetated trails that are not part of the designated trail network. Those things, in combination, significantly improve water quality relative to business as usual. Reduce water quality caused by human waste. These are kind of nodal types of phenomenon, but putting in sanitation facilities at trailheads and designated campsites is clearly a smart and wise thing to do. And installing advanced septic field technologies in rural residential is very important to try and keep those organics from human waste and those pathogens out of surface and aquifer water. So the conclusions on phase 2 is that relative to the business as usual scenario, the simulated adoption of beneficial management practices in the GHOST improved all ecological indicators, that is, relative to business as usual. Landscape level improvements in ecological indicators included a decrease in grizzly bear mortality index, an increase in integrity of native fish, an increase in water quality, an increase in non-motorized recreational potential, and a level of fall down in future for the forest sector that is much less likely than we're currently expecting. Now, important to recognize that whereas BMPs demonstrated significant improvement to the performance of these indicators, many, even with BMPs, continued to perform below range of natural variability values. So that takes us to the next conversation, which is that a combination of not only beneficial management practices, but landscape thresholds for land use intensity will be required if, in fact, we're going to manage this watershed to ensure optimal landscape integrity. In other words, we can't completely get out of trouble with BMPs. BMPs have value, they have merit, they need to be discussed, they need to be adopted, we need to figure out how to pay for them, but we also need to talk about thresholds and limits. So what we have in Alberta is an economy that is supercharged. We have no problem attracting risk capital. We mix that risk capital with workforce. We don't have as much workforce as we need, so we have lots of immigration. We take that risk capital and our workforce and we draw down on ecological goods and services and we produce commodities in the GHOST. We produce cattle, crops, wood fiber, gas, oil, motorized recreation, non-motorized recreation, residential, on and on. But there's a growing recognition that as we have increased these commodity productions, we have also begun to draw down on ecological goods and services bank account. And we are paying a price. And it's high time that people recognize that we are maxing out on our ecological goods and services credit card. And the GHOST will change significantly. It already has begun to change as we conduct more and more of these types of land uses. So, in many ways, we have an unbalanced system today. We recognize the benefits that all these land uses create, the jobs, the royalties, the rents, the recreational potential. But there is a price that is being paid. And that price is the slow but measurable draining of water quality, water quantity, organics, wildlife habitat, and air quality. And what people, I think, want is a recognition that both of these types of economic performance have merit. So yes, we want food and settlements and fuel and fiber and recreation, but we also want ecological goods and services, and what we need to do is put them all on the table for a common discussion. And when we do that, it's going to create a dialogue where we're going to realize that there's some really tough decisions. These decisions are going to involve trade-offs and limits and thresholds and risks and require knowledge. And it's basically moving to management by objective. What do we want from the Ghost River watershed? What is its destiny? What role will it play in Alberta and west of Calgary? And what land uses in combinations and where will deliver us that desired objectives? So, yes, the Ghost is contributing to GDP, and we need to recognize that that's very important. But to do that, it has to be fueled, and it's fueled by natural resource accounts. But at the same time, it draws down these accounts, so they begin to perform at lower values. And those accounts are what we call ecological goods and services. And the folks in the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society, and I think Albertans in general, are saying that they want a redefinition of true economic performance. which is GDP, and ecological goods and services. They both can be measured as economic contributions, and that's what we would like for our kids and our grandkids. So that requires a different way of thinking about things, and this is going to be an awkward, difficult discussion by many people, including myself, which is these catchments, these basins, these watersheds have economic value, and they need to be thought of as such. And that can reflect itself in many ways: water quality and quantity, storage of carbon, wildlife, tourism and recreation, even food balance. And if you add all these up, you could call that ecological goods and services. And the ability of these landscapes to provide those ecological goods and services are going to be a function of how we treat them, what land uses occur, how much of the landscape is allocated in that land use, and the intensity of those land uses. Okay, so what we've shown is that how we grow our crops, how we grow our cattle, how we log our trees is not necessarily maintaining ecological goods and services. Okay, that's fine. It's easy to say, but we need to remind ourselves that these land uses only make money in a free enterprise economy by selling their commodities, which right now is crops and beef and lumber. And if we want to change that behavior, we need to reward people with the current typical currency of a free enterprise economy, which is money, which means we need to diversify the commodities for which people are paid. So farmers being paid not only for crops, but also with water quality and quantity and carbon and wildlife. And the same in the ranching industry, and the same with the logging community. If we want them to change their practices, then we need to reward change practices with improper inducements, and monetary will be one. So what the Ghost Watershed has done so far is understood where they are, understood how they got to where they are, and has understood the consequences of business as usual, which they say that's an undesirable destination, we don't want to go there. They've understood beneficial management practices, which mitigate a lot of these risks, but still may create a landscape that is not acceptable. And what I would suggest is that the next conversation would be that of management by objective, which means let's decide what the Ghost Watershed should do, and let's ask ourselves, it's literally flipping it upside down, what land use practices would actually deliver those commodities through time, those ecological goods and services, and that's a fundamentally different discussion. And that's the most logical next place for it to go. Now to do that, the Ghost River Watershed needs to put all of the major stakeholders around the table. So certainly the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society would be one, so would be the MD of Bighorn. The Alberta Land Use Framework, of course, would be an important player there. The Calgary Regional Plan, Forestry and Spray Lakes, the Ghost Waiparous Operational Access Management Plan as part of the table of conversation. The off-highway vehicle communities would need to be there, as would farmers and ranchers and First Nations, the oil and gas industry, people who understand ecological goods and services as resource economists, the ecological community that can help people understand the interface between land uses and water quality and quantity, and people that are quite knowledgeable in natural disturbance regimes. So it's a collaborative approach. It's bringing all people together, sitting around the metaphorical table, having a chat about the Ghost, where it is, where do we want it to go, and what land uses through space and time take us there. This report is currently being reviewed by a series of domain experts, and their commentary will be incorporated into the final PowerPoint and the final report. I'd like to acknowledge the funders of the work, Alberta EcoTrust, the Calgary Foundation, the Bow River Basin Council, and all workshop participants and the project advisors of the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society and their board.